Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth episode of Flying with Phoenix speaker series hosted by LTF Venture at the University of Chicago. LTF Venture is a student-run VC at the University of Chicago, and the Flying with Phoenix speaker series was launched last year, where we invite industry leaders and corporate executives and startup founders to come and share with us ideas they have about businesses and the economy and career advancement in general. And today it is our great honor to have Mark Webb from Dominion Energy to join us for this conversation. So welcome, Mark.
Great, thank you, David. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. And before we jump on into all this wonderful question that our students have submitted beforehand, and those ones that might pop up later on in the live Q&A chat box, just want to give everybody a brief introduction of who Mark is. So Mark is the Senior Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer of Dominion Energy. He's responsible for all efforts to foster innovation, creativity, and development in Dominion's people, processes, and strategies for a sustainable future. During his 25+ years career at Dominion, Mark worked mostly in legal and policy affairs, assuming the responsibility of General Counsel in 2013 and Chief Legal Officer in 2017. Prior to joining Dominion, Mark was an associate at Andrews and Kurth in Houston from 1993 to 95, and at Hunton and Williams in Richmond from 95 to 97. Mark holds a bachelor's degree in history from Texas Christian University and earned his law degree from University of Virginia School of Law. Mark is also a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. So again, welcome to our speaker series, Mark.
Great. Glad to be here again.
Again, I guess before we get into the questions, just for the benefits of the audience here today, many of whom might not have heard of Dominion, even if a lot of them might be their customers. So what does Dominion do, and what's your position in Dominion? What does it mean?
So I'll just give you a very brief overview for those of you who aren't familiar. Dominion Energy, we're a very large energy company. We own multiple public utilities on both the electric and gas side. We've got about 7.5 million retail customers, primarily in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Ohio, West Virginia, and Utah. We have a gas company out in Utah that also covers small parts of Idaho and Wyoming. And then we also own solar plants in multiple parts of the country. And we own a very large nuclear facility in Connecticut that supplies 90% of the clean energy in Connecticut. And we developed and now own 50% of a liquefied natural gas export facility in Code Point, Maryland, that supplies natural gas to customers in India and Japan. So we repositioned our company about 3 years ago and exited our interstate natural gas pipeline business to focus less on natural gas other than on the local delivery company side. But really, think of us as the company that produces and delivers and transmits energy, whether it's electricity or natural gas, to homes, businesses, and industry.
Thank you for that. So it's really a conglomerate that covers everything from energy production to distribution, and covers basically most of the East Coast, I'd say.
Yeah, a lot of the mid-Atlantic part of the East Coast, and we operate as in those states where we are a traditional vertically integrated utility where we do everything from the production, the delivery, and the transmission.
Great. And before we go in deeper into Dominion, we just want to speak briefly about your career, Mark, because it's quite an interesting career. You graduated from UVA Law in '93, and you started first as a law firms, which is quite a traditional path for any JD holders. Right. And you worked 2 years in Houston, 2 years in Virginia. How did you like your work as a lawyer, and what was the factor that made you decide to leave the so-called big law and to become in-house counsel here at Dominion?
So obviously I didn't like it enough to remain a lawyer, but no, I did enjoy it. I think the law is fascinating generally. And when I got out of law school, I was a corporate attorney. I did M&A and corporate securities at Andrews and Kurth, Houston, with not surprisingly in Houston, large energy focus. And then I came back home really to Hunton and Williams, which is a large firm in Richmond, where I did again, a lot of real estate investment trusts, some energy work, but I did a lot of structured finance type transactions as a lawyer and M&A. And really, I shouldn't admit this, but I made the decision to leave one Saturday morning, and I worked very hard, like most associates do. There early, leaving late, a lot of weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, because you're on the path. And I came in one Saturday, and we shared our building with a local investment bank, and every partner space at the law firm had a car in it on a Saturday morning, and every space that was designated for the senior people at the investment bank was empty. And I said, I knew they made more money, and I said, I'm not sure this path makes much sense. Maybe there's something else to this besides working all the time and having less money. So I began looking around and was familiar with Dominion Energy, and it at the time had done some acquisitions of some utilities in the United Kingdom. So I knew they would probably look for some additional support. So I had a friend who had recently gone over there and contacted her and got an interview with the then general counsel and was hired. And, it was very different at the beginning. I worked with, we had non-regulated assets we had a merchant bank, a commercial lending bank, real estate development, and oil and gas operations. And that's what I supported initially. And that's led to the current position.
Oh, great. What a pivot. And you made another great pivot later on in your career, much more recent, because in your 25 plus years in Dominion, you mainly worked in legal and regulatory functions, right? That's a lot of dealing with risk management, compliance, government work.
Right.
And now you are the Chief Innovation Officer. So that's a puzzle I want you to help me with. How do you go from compliance focus to innovation focus? And does, I guess the past experience in the legal and regulatory field empowers you more, or do you feel more constrained by it?
For me, I think it always depends on the person. I think some people are just naturally more curious or open to new things, or always thinking, is there a better way to do this? I'm the person who sits, every time I board an airplane, trying to, through my mind, think of better ways to board an aircraft, or better ways to, as I'm at a stoplight, surely there's a better way to control these stoplights so that we're not all sitting here. So some of that, I think, just depends on who you are. But the other thing, I think, at least in coming from a corporate law background, negotiating transactions and contracts, you're really a problem solver. And you're identifying needs, and what does it take to get something done, and you're being creative. Nobody thinks of lawyers as creative, but a good lawyer has to be creative, because your job is not to try to put in such onerous terms in an agreement that nothing happens. You want to get the agreement done, and it means understanding what the other side wants, same way you would understand what a customer wants, and coming up with a solution that satisfies everybody, at least enough to get something done. So from that standpoint, I think the law is a strong background. The other thing is that lawyers are taught we can argue either side, and we look at either side, and we never really get totally sold one way or the other, because we're always ready to have to pivot if something demands that we argue. So you're always analyzing both sides of something. I went to UVA, which at the time was really a law and economics focused legal curriculum. So I think the other thing, at least in that background, is from a legal perspective, I viewed everything in the law as being that there was an underlying economic driver behind it, whether it's a motivating factor or a policy factor. And I think that too, probably in my particular circumstance, made it, it shapes the view of things and the way you think of things, that prepares you. And I think also, because a company like Dominion Energy, we're not Pfizer, we're not IBM, where we're actually inventing and doing original scientific innovation of new cell structures or something like that. What we're looking to do is applied innovation. So we're looking for new techniques, new ways of delivering energy, new business models, and applying an innovation that someone else might have created, but figuring out how does it work in our business? How can we make it fit for us? And so, I'm not an engineer. I could never come up with designing a better solar cell to replace the polysilicon. That's not what we do. We don't do basic research, but we can think of ways to innovate in the way we deploy them, the way that they are packaged, how we use them, how it fits into a grid. Those are the types of innovations that we can pursue. And I think that, at least for me, the law is a good background for that.
So it's interesting you talk about, I guess, the distinction between basic research that's being done, right? Pfizer, IBM, and the kind of innovation, process innovation, commercialization innovation that's happening here at Dominion. It's a case to be made. Perhaps the ones that you are doing could be more impactful in the sense that, if someone just conjure up something, a lab, and never commercializes, it never gets deployed and never actually transform the way that energy affects household and businesses. So I guess an obvious question of that is, what plays into your decision-making process as the CIO on where and how Dominion should innovate, right? Is it more of a top-down approach where the board will give you direction? Or is it more of a bottom-up approach where you go around into divisions, maybe you walk on the power plants yourself and ask the employees what are the bottlenecks, and then you go back to office to innovate based on those bottom-up feedback? How does that process in your position works?
It's certainly not top-down. I think, other than I think the board, asks questions as they should and wants to make sure they understand the rapid changes that are occurring in the energy business and things that affect the energy business. They want to make sure we're on top of it, and they give that direction, and management supports it. But our approach has been that, at least at our company, with the utility, which generally most of the folks at the utilities have been taught for 100 years, don't innovate. Don't do anything that's not tried and true and proven. So we've really begun with sort of a bottom-up approach. First is, like many companies, we're not alone. Some consumer products companies might be the same way. But first you have to change the culture, and to get people basic elements of design thinking, to get people embedded in the business units who think about innovation. They're not afraid to innovation. We always tell them it's not that we're looking to cut costs, that would be a good side benefit of some things, but we're also looking for better ways to do it, safer ways to do it, something that improves customer service, eliminates time. And we have a lot of internal competitions, things like we call it Spark Tank. That's kind of like a Shark Tank where employees can pitch their own ideas and concepts as though it was a business, even though it's just an internal effort. And then we really kind of center it around, on the big picture, from like, what are the fundamental drivers that are transforming the energy future, and how do we adapt for that? We look at four things. We know that distributed energy and distributed resources is going to be a big part of the way energy is delivered. And by that, we mean solar panels on people's roofs, batteries at their homes, the potential of electric vehicles to provide support to a grid. And we look at the role of, and we look at transportation. Number one source of carbon emissions in the United States is transportation. We know it's going to decarbonize. The quickest and most likely path to that is electrification. Mm-hmm. What's our role there? Right. We want to accelerate, we want to support it, but we have to do it in the right way, because it can really help the grid. But done the wrong way, it could be an issue for the grid to respond to it. We look at decarbonization society-wide, and know that what we do can make everyone else use less carbon. And so we're looking at things that have cross sustainability efforts, things like indoor agriculture, where if we can provide renewable energy, that's one element of it. But we're also allowing someone to grow greens in downtown Chicago in January. I'm not saying us, but ComEd or whoever's there could, and you're saving water that would otherwise be used in California. You're eliminating the transportation and the carbon emissions associated with that. And there are many things like that have multiple compounding sustainability impacts across the economy. So we look at sort of that big picture directive. And then the last thing that we've focused on and get people to focus on is what we call the digitization of everything. I think we call it the zettabyte economy. It used to be something else, but now we're at zettabyte. But it's the exponential growth in data, and computing power, and how those two things in combination will transform energy usage and energy delivery. Like there are a lot of things. We're not unique, but in energy in particular, the ability to pinpoint with precision energy efficiency programs, where energy is being wasted, understanding resources that may be available, and being able to make them respond to a need for the grid instantaneously. And that's where the computing power comes in. You know, we're not there yet with the ability to integrate quantum computing with some of the data, but I think over the next 10 years that the role of data and computers is going to be every bit as important to decarbonization as building solar farms and wind farms.
Great, thank you for that comprehensive answer. There's so much I want to unpack there. The grid, decarbonization, electric vehicles, and digitalization. Before I do that, last question I want to ask you about your career and how who you are is your service in the U.S. Air Force. How does that shape your worldview? You know, if it has in any significant ways, or shape who you are as a person.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Not many people ask me that, so it's good to see that, and I've thought about it. And I think one thing is it makes me realize that the world we live in, that we in the United States and other countries like us, it's a fragile world in terms of the comforts that we're used to, like a reliable electric grid, a reliable energy grid, the ability to do the things that we do. We saw how supply chain could be so quickly interrupted with just COVID. And I think when you're in the military, and you know, I happened to be at a what was called a Strategic Air Command base in Texas, where we had crews that were on alert 24/7, who lived next to the runway to respond in the event of a nuclear attack.
Right.
And you know, people don't think about that. That this defense is out there, and it's the world we live in, and it's all invisible to people who aren't in the military, who are out there defending it. You know, there are those in the world who don't like the world that, you know, the West and other free countries have built, and they have a different vision. And I think that we sometimes forget that. And so I always forget that, particularly in the world of energy, which I think there's always been an outsized geopolitical significance in energy and the use and deployment of armed forces to secure an energy supply.
I had no idea that you worked in a Strategic Air Command, where there's literally the first line of defense against any nuclear attack. But let's tempting as it is, let's refrain from indulging into geopolitics in this chat. But energy, which is equally exciting, let's focus on that. And I guess one question, very general, I think Mary just asked in the chat, is maybe we can start from there. Is what's your perspective, just in general, on the future of renewable energy in the U.S. And developing countries? Perhaps focus a little more in the U.S. because your background here was Dominion.
I mean, it's just going to continue to grow. I mean, I think the one thing we see, you know, particularly with solar, is that it will be ubiquitous. I mean, you see it now sewn into canvas on tents. You know, a portable pack you can take with you and fold to charge your phone. I mean, it's flexible. You can carry it anywhere. So its role will continue to grow. It's obviously not the cheapest if you want 24/7 power, but when it's producing, it is the cheapest. You know, and once you have it, it continues to produce, and there's no added fuel cost. There's no volatility in the fuel cost, but there's volatility that you can't predict in the availability of the sun, per se, and cloud cover. So as good as it is, it has limitations, but it will be growing and continue to grow in terms of its contributions to our energy supply. I think globally, you know, you always heard stories about countries that skipped over having landlines and building out a telecom network and went straight to mobile phones. And I think, you know, you'll see areas that can do that with batteries. They'll never, I mean, with solar panels, they can skip over building the type of grid that we have, because they don't necessarily need it for, you know, what their needs are, in particular in a rural village in parts of India that may not have electricity yet, or adequate electricity. But from a global perspective, I think you'll see offshore wind, which we are building, will be the large. We have the first 2 wind turbines and offshore winds federal waters off the coast of Virginia. We're going to build more than 6,000 megawatts of offshore. That's like 200 wind turbines that are each almost 500 feet tall over the next 6 years. That will continue to grow. And wind, offshore wind in particular, it's expensive, but it's very productive relative to onshore wind, at least in Virginia. It's almost produces twice as much. There's twice as much wind speed out there. Again, it's not 24/7, but its role. So that percentage of renewable energy will continue to grow. I think the harder part will be, carbon free, which of course is nuclear, and potentially hydrogen. You can make renewable hydrogen. It's very costly because you have to have excess renewable energy that you then convert, and it's not the most efficient process today. And then at some point, we'll have to determine, natural gas, to get to that last 10 or 15% of a grid that's carbon free, whether or not, does it make sense to extract more batteries for that excess support, or do we keep running natural gas for a while until we've developed an adequate alternative resource through some sort of technology that people talk about and have probably talked about for decades, like a nuclear fusion, but we're not there yet. It's one of those things, kind of like hydrogen.
Fusion is always 20 years away.
Exactly.
So thank you for that answer. And let's just stay on solar energy, dive a little deeper in that. As you said, solar energy is if you can produce it, it's already as cheap, if not cheaper, than fossil fuels. But of course, there's the problem of seasonality and just there's no sun at night, and so you can only produce a certain hours. Especially here in Chicago, I guess you can only produce like 4 hours a day, maybe a little exaggeration. So one thing that you need when it is producing it, of course, is battery technology. How has battery technology advanced in the industry in order to measure up to that role that it has to play in renewable energy storage? Are we at that point where we have big enough and efficient enough batteries that can be cheaply integrated with the grid and with the solar production that makes it competitive, economically competitive, to replace fossil fuel in some part of the country?
For the most part, no. I mean, I think that for limited durations of time, and at certain price points, batteries are there. I think typically battery storage is the most efficient for about 2 to 4 hours, is the sweet spot for the effectiveness. Well, that helps, but it doesn't get there. And remember, to charge a battery, you have to have excess solar, for instance. But that's not the only answer. And I think the other thing with batteries is we have to remember we're trying to electrify transportation at the same time. And the lithium-ion batteries that have been developed for transportation are really the same things we're doing for stationary batteries for the most part. There's some new companies out there with some approaches using iron and some other things years away. I think that we're already discovering it, that the global supply chain in terms of extraction and mining for lithium, nickel and cobalt, and then the production of battery cells, it's not going to be there. It's going to be years before it can build up to meet the demand for electric vehicles. And then if you layer in a demand for stationary storage, it's going to be, it's that much more demand. So the question to me is going to be the timing of it. And then you begin to look at other, to the extent that you can. I think there's a company called Form Energy that is announced, an MIT spinoff that's looking at an iron-based battery that has a longer duration. If that works and it's cheaper and can eliminates fire risk and can last for 2 days, that's an incredible innovation. There's a lot of research going into batteries and battery development, not just to increase the duration, but to change the battery chemistry so that you can use different minerals that we don't have to mine for cobalt in the Congo, or if we can put a different metal in. But there are other forms of storage. For years we have a very large. It's called pumped hydro. A lot of these companies that built nuclear plants in the 70s, they paired nuclear produces all the time. So there was always an excess amount of energy at night. So a lot of the companies that own nuclear plants built pumped hydro, pure economics. When prices at nighttime, when electricity prices were low, it pumped water into an artificially made reservoir and released it during the daytime like it was a hydro plant. We have a 3,000 megawatt plus facility in Virginia. At one time, it was the largest in the world. I'm not sure. There might be one in China that's surpassed it now, but you can't. I don't think you could permit those anymore because of just like the hydropower has fallen out of favor because of artificial altering dams and water areas. But obviously, that's a great resource. The other thing I would note is just again going back to that role of data. In the role of automation, if you can imagine that the other way with that excess solar is with price signals and controlling more efficient timing of when people use electricity. You can also imagine some of that need for excess solar being more easily available to charge batteries during the day. And then ultimately, the obvious thing is if you've got electric cars out there that are parked, for most people who drive cars, retail consumers, you're driving an hour a day,
right.
Which it means that your car, if it's plugged in, which it could be if you were incented to plug it in, you don't have to charge every day. But imagine if the grid could draw on those in mass. It's like an Airbnb approach. Every vehicle that's out there that's hooked up has a battery that's idle. An idle asset has value. And so when we balance the degradation of the battery with what the optimal discharge is, you can imagine it both powering the grid, sending power to the grid, or even sending power to your home. It could charge your home battery. Tesla's got some software out there called AutoBid, I think, where they pair solar on the roof, battery on the wall, battery in your car, and the three work in tandem. And so that works because of, again, the ability of a computer to analyze rates, grid needs, and to do it instantly, and understanding the location and where it is. Understanding the locations of where those cars are is critical. On the electric grid, not every resource has the same value. It depends on where it is at a particular time as to the maximum amount of its value. So that's, again, I think will be the next answer. But that's a lot if you're familiar with the energy industry, but I could talk for days, but I'll stop there.
No, that's absolutely great. And you mentioned a little bit China, and of course it's the largest and second largest energy consumption countries in the world, China and the US, and their innovation matters a lot to how global consumption of energy and carbon emission will go. There's a difference that's very clear that in China, where you have a very central approach on energy planning, they have state-owned enterprise, and then when they promulgate some kind of innovation, they do it throughout the country. They do it very quickly. Here in the US, it seems to me a little more piecemeal, where you have different companies that's in different states regulated by different state instead of more like a federal approach. Which way do you think is better at fostering innovation? And if the US with its more fragmented system is able to lead into this renewable energy of our century?
Ultimately, I think our way wins. I think that it sounds appealing. If I could sit there and say right now we should, all cars will be electric, and we're going to use this formula, or we'll do this. You could get something done.
Yes.
They can get an Olympic Village built in 6 months, or whatever it is, right? I mean, there is a but I think historically the command and control, I think stifling innovation. There's always a different way to do it that may be better than what someone at the moment thinks is the right thing. And when you go in all in one way, and then the next best thing comes out. I give an example. With electric vehicles and the way they charge, people have talked a lot about smart chargers in people's homes, so that when you plug in, the charger will control when you charge. You tell it what you're willing to do and when you need it, and the charger controls it. You may park at 5, but it won't begin charging until 11. It responds to a price signal from the grid, et cetera. And that makes a lot of sense. And it's a great tool. And in fact, we're doing a pilot, and most utilities have. And then 6 months ago, I sat through a pitch from a startup that says, we don't need the smart charger, which has a cost and obviously an installation cost. We can do it with the telematics data from vehicles, and they can transmit it directly to it. And the cars themselves can control it. And you don't need that charger. And at least with some cars, they're right. But imagine if, the edict had gone down, every new home must have this smart charger. You never would have had this potential. I'm not saying that this innovation is the winner, but I think you need that small startup that can come up with a better way, a more nimble way. And I think, especially in a country like us, in the United States, everything's not the same. Regions are different, energy supplies are different, climates are different. When you talk about, California, San Francisco, banning the use of natural gas in homes for heat. Well, I've been to Palo Alto. Of course you can ban natural gas for heat because you don't need much heat. But tell that to people in Chicago. Starting tomorrow, you're not going to allow natural gas to be used to generate heat. It's a harder solution. Generally, you find, people in different states come up with solutions that fit them and localities. So I think that in the end, we know that our way will produce more innovation ultimately.
Great, I totally agree. The flexibility it provides, decentralized geniuses almost always work better. So from the Paris Agreement to COP26, the US has made a lot of ambitious goals for emission cutting, and you talk about this as well. The Biden administration wants to achieve net zero carbon emission by 2050, I think. That was the most recent pledge, and it was very ambitious because nearly 40% of all carbon emission these days still come from power plants that burns fossil fuels. So do you think the US is on its way to achieving this ambitious goal? As the CIO of a very large utility company, do you go to bed thinking about how much carbon emission you've saved today or this month? And I guess just more of a factual question is, what is the portfolio of fossil versus renewable that Dominion currently have, and where is it heading?
So we're clearly heading toward reducing fossil, particularly, we are about, in terms of production, I think about 40% nuclear, which is zero carbon, and natural gas is about another 40%. And so our coal, and don't hold me to this because it, sometimes I'm not sure where it was last year, but it was getting down to like 12 or 13% in terms of production. We've closed multiple coal plants over the last 5-6 years. The United States electric industry itself has done a phenomenal job of carbon reduction, primarily on the back of natural gas. We've built a lot of renewables, solar and wind, but it's natural gas that is really cheap natural gas that's displaced coal because it's a 24/7 resource. Natural gas is available, and it also is a flexible resource that can respond to solar and wind. Unlike even coal, natural gas plants can fire on an instant and support, basically play the role of a battery for rapid discharge and support the grid. I think that the goal, particularly with our nuclear fleet, by 2050, of course, is attainable. I think some of the targets that people will talk about, 2030 or 2035, are extremely difficult. Especially if you look broader across all of the sources of carbon, including industry, transportation, agriculture, I think you've got to look at everything. I think transportation, there's no reason why passenger transportation for vehicles shouldn't electrify. I mean, it's perfectly suited for it. You get the trucks, rigs, it's a harder thing. A 1 megawatt battery may weigh 20,000 pounds on a truck that can pull 70,000 pounds. Well, that's a lot of cargo capacity that you have to give up. And I'm not in logistics, but I think any of us can understand that losing the ability to carry a certain additional amount of cargo doesn't help your bottom line. So I think that's got to be, and then charging it is much longer. but it will come. Either hydrogen or electric trucks will happen. Aviation, much more difficult. I think, you'll see some small electric aircraft, four-seaters, air taxis, those types of things. I think you're already seeing it. Large-scale commercial airlines will be tough. More likely to see some type of biofuels. I think 2050 is attainable, and we can probably beat it, certainly in some areas. And I think we should also talk about what happens after 2050, because the convenient thing with 2050 is that after that, a lot of our existing nuclear plants will be retired. Many of them will be extended to 80 years of life, and that takes them through 2050, but not much beyond. And when that happens in the United States, I think it's around total as a country, 18 to 20% of our zero carbon, zero emissions electric supply. That's a big hole to fill. I mean, just to give you an example, there was a study out, this was 2 years ago, it's probably changed, but there was an MIT article that 2 years ago, the number of nuclear plants that we had closed for economic reasons, meaning they couldn't compete in the markets, the carbon benefits of having those nuclear plants and losing that benefit had completely erased all of the solar that had been installed since the time that Barack Obama had become president and where we really began. So just, the loss of one nuclear plant can, essentially wipe out the value that you gain from adding, thousands and thousands of solar panels. So it's one of those things we have to make a decision on, whether it's small modular reactors or something else, but how do you really get to zero carbon? Not just in 2050, but beyond, without something like hydrogen or advanced nuclear.
Great. And it's fascinating, right? When you say the value of nuclear power in this transition is absolutely critical. But one of our audience will actually ask a question that, in the past 26 years of US history, is only construction of one new nuclear plant. Why has its popularity waned so much? Is it for purely economic reasons? Is this an irrational fear from the public that in turn pressures the state and local government to make it, impossible for any company to construct new power plants? And what is the solution there? Our friends at the Gates Foundation, I think they are also looking into producing a new generation of nuclear reactor that can feed on its own waste. So which is very ideal for energy solution on the long term, but it couldn't get a permission to do that here in the US. And they tried to do it in China, but the trade war just disrupted that whole plan. So what is it in the US that is preventing people to accept nuclear?
To note, obviously in the rest of the world, they are constructing nuclear power plants, Kazakhstan even, and other parts. But I think we have two factors. One is the cost. The current nuclear plant that's under construction by the Southern company called Vogtle, they're going to approach $30 billion for about a 1,600 megawatt facility, something like that. And luckily they had partners, co-ops. That's still an enormous amount of capital. Even for a company, the Southern company is about our size with a market cap of 70 billion or so, depending on the day and month. That's a significant risk. We took over 2 years ago a company in South Carolina that at the time was called Scana, who had begun construct. They were much smaller than we were. They were constructing a nuclear plant, and the cost overruns made it unbuildable and put the company on the verge of bankruptcy. And we came in and took it over, and had to abandon the project. And a lot of folks, there's been a lot of focus, cost overruns, significant blow to that. Obviously, the company ceased to be independent. So when you take on a big undertaking like that as an individual company, it's a huge project, and it takes 8 years. Well, for a utility like us or Southern Company, you don't get to actually collect from your customers until it begins producing electricity. So you're carrying that debt burden on your balance sheet without any cash coming in. And so you can imagine what it does to credit metrics and ratios as you build it. I think the other thing that's because of what happened, we can't overlook Chernobyl and Fukushima, and the effect that has on public opinion. And so there's some level of making people confident in the safety. There's never been a death associated with the operation of a nuclear plant in the United States. We have very high safety standards, but I don't think most people would think that if they're asked. They don't, they forget that we had coal explosions at coal plants, or somewhere, probably someone has been injured by a wind farm. I don't know that, but you can imagine something. But I think that's the obstacle. We've never had a support like a tax credit that we've seen go for wind and solar, carbon capture now. Some types of it are eligible for tax credits. So I think some type of assistance like that is probably what it's going to take. In addition to, one of the advantages when you talk about what Bill Gates is doing in other small companies, these small nuclear reactors, we call them SMRs. One of the advantages to them is they're smaller, which means they may not be on to build the same amount, it may cost you the same amount of money, but you don't have to do it all at once. So you can imagine a small modular reactor that may be 1/10 the size of a large nuclear facility. You could do one, and then another, and then another. And so as you do that and they come online, you're staggering that you don't take the same financial exposure and the threat to revenue. So that type of, again, that's just a different way to look at it. You're getting a better technology, safer, but you're also getting something that's financeable and buildable.
Is that something Dominion would think about approaching, that different kind of smaller scale, more easily financeable nuclear power plants in the future?
I think we have said that we have a team that, like almost anyone in the industry, everyone is looking at the potential of small modular reactors or other forms of advanced nuclear technology, along with potential for hydrogen.
Great. We talked a lot about energy generation, solar, wind, nuclear, but there's another part downstream, which is transmission, distribution, equally important. The big part of that is the grid. And we just saw from the news that regulators in your home state, Virginia, recently approved a massive plan, $650 million for Dominion to transform its grid here in the state. What is the significance of that transformation, and what are perhaps other key enabling investment that's necessary to successfully transfer to a renewable grid that is going to help with all those ambitious emission cutting and energy consumption goals?
So I think the approval in Virginia was critical. I think it hits all types of things that I've talked about, from our ability to get information and data on the grid, collect data to understand electric flows that are occurring on the grid, control voltage levels better, which is very important. With solar in particular, solar is, as we have said, it can be everywhere: rooftops, homes, businesses. And most people, when they put solar, they expect on their rooftops, a fair number of them expect at some point in time they're delivering power back to the grid. So a grid that was built 100 years ago to carry power in one direction, meaning from a central plant to a transmission substation, to a transmission line, to a distribution substation, to a distribution line, to your home, stepping it down every step, the voltage, every step along that path. Suddenly we've got power coming in from other sources, and in small amounts and in unpredictable amounts. We don't know if someone's going to deliver power or not, but we have to be ready for it. I mean, if you're at the home and you're net metering. Electric vehicles, same thing. And now you've got a demand, that moves and may charge at different spots. Every vehicle is like a little apartment in terms of its electric demand. So you can imagine that we've always built electric service to deliver power to a premise. And you can build some pretty good algorithms, 2,000 square foot home. You can predict, these are your appliances. We can predict what, in most cases, within, 10%, depending on whether you're a high user or what your comfort level is, what the usage is going to be, and you can size the grid correctly. With electric vehicles, it introduces a whole new level of suddenly you've got things moving around to charge. Maybe it charges one day at home, one day at work. Maybe you've got guests coming. Maybe all of a sudden there's no one's at work because it's a school snow day, and all of a sudden everyone's plugged in at home before they were at their work. So you've got to have a grid. To do that, you have to have intelligence on the grid to collect the data. You've got to have the assets on the grid that can manage and control the voltage better, so that you don't have, voltage sags. If you have any electrical engineers, they will tell you, the grid's not just, it's not some magic. It's a flow of electrons and depends on physics. And you have to maintain a certain amount of spinning electrons to keep the power flowing. And that's not, we don't even think about it. But we've got, electrical engineers and control rooms that are constantly monitoring and controlling the grid and responding, and keeping what we now all just think exists always, which is a grid that for the most part is on all the time, and we never have issues with it, other than a big storm or something like that. That's the type of investment we need, because to accommodate the renewables, you'll need that type of investment, and then even just increased demand. If you think that if we're going to electrify transportation, and then ultimately if there's electrification of space heating in homes, well, all of a sudden that home that used to use, say, 1,000 kilowatts a month may use 1,500 kilowatts a month. Well, that means that the calculations on the size of the transformers that we did when that subdivision was built, and then the size of the substation, they're all wrong now. So you've got to build better transformers. You've got to build different substations. It's all good, but it leads to decarbonization. But it's the type of thing that this approval leads to, in sort of transforming the grid. It's not just, everyone forgets about these wires that we see that we probably curse because we don't think it looks good in the backyard or over the street. But that's ultimately what brings it to you, as you know. And in maintaining that and being able to accommodate all these new things is going to take investment. And that's what a policy and then an approval like this does.
Absolutely. And it's not just investment, right? It's the approval itself is critical, as you said. And as a regulated utility, almost everything you do investment wise, you have to get approvals somewhere, state, local, federal government. So how do you navigate that? Is the existing vision that you have at Dominion aligned with the state and federal regulations? If not, how do you maneuver? And what should be changed in your mind in order to realize the smart grid in Dominion's conception? What if the new governor all of a sudden signed his executive order to stop it in the middle of your construction? How do you deal about it? Now, I guess I can see a little bit of the connection between doing compliance and now doing innovation, because
right,
innovation, a lot of it is trying to renegotiate and break free from some of those constraints and get approval to do new things, right? So yeah, that was my question.
Exactly. Well, and we're not alone. I mean, you see it in telecommunications with the 5G battle that's going on now, and the approvals to do those and put up those towers. But I think that, there's policy and then there's the regulators. And I think the policy is important because whether it's state or federal, that sets the regulators are there to approve costs, but they follow the law. And so if the policy that a state legislature or the federal government puts in place that says, we want clean energy, or we want to make sure that when you analyze a solar facility, you're going to take into account the environmental benefits, not just the pure dollars of that. Or when we propose electric vehicle infrastructure, you're going to take into account the clean air benefits and the carbon savings and whatever all the other potential benefits. With the regulators, I think one, we have to make a case. We have to show why the whatever we're seeking approval to do, it complies with the policies and directives set with the state, however general or broad they may be, and we have to make the case, the benefits of it. And there's a cost and there's a benefit. How are they shared, and why should all customers pay for something what's the benefit to them? And so every time we go in, we have to make that case, and and you don't always win. I think in general, if you have the policy support and you make a strong case, you can get the approval, but you have to make the strong case. What they don't want is waste, and they don't want to see something deployed all at once that's not proven per se. So that, to your point about what needs to change, I mean, to me, the one thing that would be good would be to have, and this is true of all utility regulators, is to have some greater flexibility for a much quicker ability to do small tests, pilots of emerging and new technology, and not have, if we have to wait 18 months or demonstrate and bring, say you've got $1 million test, but you have to spend $500,000 on lawyers to come in and present witnesses. I mean, it kills it.
Right.
So I think that flexibility, if we're going to really advance it, I think giving utilities that flexibility to do that would really change things. And then we have the burden of making sure that we don't waste it, in terms of having a project that goes over budget or that doesn't have an objective beyond that's worth doing.
Now
it's
that
sort of
makes,
like looking at,
absolutely. Now that makes a lot of sense to me, why there are so many lawyers and JD holders in energy companies, because a lot of it is making that case before you can do anything.
Right.
Thank you for that, for very illuminating. I guess one of the last question for the big energy business trend for today is about cryptocurrencies, and I have to ask all our guests about this. The mining part, I haven't asked that before because they are all just investors and speculators, but here the mining of cryptocurrencies, they can consume a lot of energy, astronomical amount. Mining one Bitcoin, for example, right, consumes 9 years of household equivalent electricity. Congress is investigating the environmental impact of crypto mining. Do you think cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin can survive another round of environmental legislation? Are cryptocurrency fundamentally contradictory to sustainability? And I guess a personal question: do you own any cryptos?
I don't. Not that I haven't thought about it. Early on, I looked at both blockchain and cryptos. I just can't see it. Seems like a virtual value. I'm just not. My mindset doesn't get around it. And I always thought that governments essentially would ultimately crack down because they don't want to lose their control of the currency. But who knows? It certainly has built a strong constituency. I think that when you look at it, and I think Bitcoin last year would have been like the 29th biggest energy consumer if it were a country. When we have a global effort to cut carbon, it does seem, again, going back to your command and control, I mean, I guess China's banned it, right? I mean,
Yes.
it seems like if you were going to rank, this is what we do to reduce global carbon, why do we need crypto mining? Would be one response. I mean, there are other benefits that you got to make the case, but that assumes that crypto mining continues to use energy that's not renewable or not zero carbon. I think ultimately there will be enough pressure that it either has to go renewable or zero carbon. I mean, you can imagine maybe that's the answer to funding a new nuclear facility, is a consortium of crypto miners could help and commit to a long-term contract. I mean, that would
would have thought.
would give you, that would make it financeable. So I just thought of that now, but I mean, I can't see it long-term because the amount of energy that's consumed is astronomical.
Yeah.
For a benefit that, well, and I'm not, I'm not a crypto person, but does that benefit, whatever it's providing, outweigh that environmental cost,
Right.
unless it begins to use zero carbon resources?
Absolutely. I'm totally with you there. So let's pivot to the last section of our discussion, which is just some quick advice that you may have for our undergraduate here who are going to go into the workplace very soon, in a few months or a year or two. So for many undergraduates, working at a utilities company does not come across as the most exciting career options, as perhaps some professional service, banking, consulting, investment, you name it. how do you convince a student, for example, those here at University of Chicago, to think about pursuing a career in energy, maybe perhaps at Dominion or any other established energy companies?
Well, I guess there are two. One, a career in energy is fascinating because I do think it, like it has been for 50 years, it's at the forefront of the global economy and efforts to decarbonize. And there's going to be a lot going on in energy, like there are a lot of things. I think for a big company, utilities, probably some other older companies, unless you're an electrical engineer, it probably doesn't have the pizzazz that going to work for a DoorDash or Airbnb or something else might, or even McKinsey or something like that. But I do think, especially for your generation, I don't think you look at it as a career. I don't think most people, that world has changed. We've had a lot of folks come in here and work for, just I can think of the last 3 years. Some really good folks we had who came in, worked for a couple of years. One is up at UVA getting a JD MBA. One's going to Fuqua at Duke right now for business school. I think a lot of business schools like experience at a real company for a couple of years. I think that the benefit you get, maybe long term after, if your path is an MBA, a consultancy firm might be great, but I don't think you can ever otherwise understand working for a company that has both union workers, non-union, the impact of that, having customers who are, all income levels, understanding the impact, sitting in a call center and listening to a single mother call in who, can't pay, an electric or gas bill and, is trying to get the heat, electricity not turned off. And you hear that and you understand sort of the real world problems. And I think it probably makes you better when you're a consultant and you go in and come up with a solution to cut call centers or increase time. It might put a little humanity into your ability to interact and relate. So I think it's good experience. Whether you make it a career, I think that's true for anything. I think, and the advice I got early on, even as a lawyer, was, look, don't think of it as this is necessarily what you're going to do your whole life. Basically, look at life, business work. It's a marathon. Every step of the way, you're going to learn something, and it's your tool that you're picking up. Whatever you do, you're going to take something from it. You're going to make contacts, and they're going to come back at some point. You're going to be able to draw on it, and it's going to be valuable. And you'll never go wrong, to me, from working anywhere, because you're going to learn some industry well. You can imagine, McKinsey or Bain. If you worked for two or 3 years as an analyst or did financial transactions at an energy company, and then you go back and get your MBA, I suspect that they're going to look pretty favorable. You might end up in their energy teams, but you're going to know that business better than anyone else, and you will. And especially if you'd be surprised if for folks who work hard, who are bright, and the level of responsibility you can get pretty quickly. In terms of really getting in and running models on big transactions, right. Big projects, it's pretty big exposure. You won't just be doing PowerPoints to get ready for a pitch.
I'm totally with you there of the consultants who are unemotional and they'll come here and cut costs. Totally. I guess the last final question of today, it's always a tradition from the LTF board, is to ask you a fun question. And the question that we always like to ask is, if you are to create a vending machine that can supply a unlimited amount of something, what would that something be, and where would you put those machines?
That's interesting. Is it a large vending machine?
It can be any size.
I think my answer would be home vehicle chargers, because I think it would make people understand how easy it is to have an electric vehicle, and I think so passionately about the need to electrify transportation and what it does, not just for carbon, but you can imagine what cities and urban environments will be without smog, without black dirt all over the sides of buildings, and without the sound of vehicles on the streets. It really can transform urban life, I think. And so I'm pretty passionate about that. Maybe I'm overstating it, but it really is, to me, that's what I would do, because for so many people, they don't understand. Their first thing is, I don't know where I'd charge. That's what I would put in my vending machine, and everyone could go home with it and it would work. And it would make an easy answer to their question.
Maybe that's a project that your team can look on investing in Virginia. But yes, thank you so much, Mark, for spending your afternoon here with the students and the LT Adventures. Thank you everyone for showing up to this session. Again, Mark, it was such a pleasure speaking with you. I hope we'll be in touch, and have a great rest of your day.
Great, thank you. You all too. Good luck with your schoolwork, and good luck in whatever you do as a career.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for having me. Okay,
Bye-bye.
thanks, David. Bye-bye.